Hello everyone, this is Dalster and welcome to another episode review of Dark Side in the Ring. And in this video, it talks about the life and tragedy of Chris Adams. I've been wondering why they have not made an episode of Chris, as I have watched episodes talking about him. He was mentioned in the episodes of Terry Gordon, Gino Hernandez, and the Von Erich family. They all were at one point in WCCW World Class Championship Wrestling. Chris was also in a tag team with Gino called the Dynamic Duo before Gino's untimely death. Chris Adams was born Christopher Adams on February 10th, 1955 in Rugby, Warwickshire, England. At the age of 9, Chris got into judo along with his younger brother Neil. His brother Neil was a two-time Olympics winner in judo, and Chris only did judo for 14 years as he moved on to another sport, which was wrestling. He joined a promotion called British Wrestling Group, where he was known as Black Belt Chris Adams. Because he was from England, Chris had an English accent and was a charmer to the ladies. He charmed a then 19-year-old girl named Jeannie, as she thought that Chris looked like Paul McCartney. Chris recruited Jeannie as a valet for wrestling, and they ended up moving to Los Angeles, California. Soon after, Jeannie was pregnant with Chris's first child, but they never married. While they were at the beach, Chris checked out the girls with bikinis, since in his home country, there weren't many women with bikinis out in the open like in LA. Jeannie was not happy about seeing Chris looking at the bikini girl since she was pregnant and felt that Chris was going to leave her. That unfortunately ended up happening as Jeannie didn't see Chris that much due to him being on the road wrestling, so she handled the pregnancy alone, even giving birth without Chris by her side. Jeannie gave birth to a girl named Jade, but Chris stopped coming home afterwards and started seeing other women. He returned home and was already seeing another woman, so Chris left his baby mama as their daughter had just come out a couple days previously. Soon after, Chris went to Dallas, Texas, and joined WCCW. Chris was then known as the Gentleman Chris Adams. At WCCW, Chris was very athletic and on par with the Von Erich brothers. Chris created the super kick, where he tapped his leg and kicked his opponent with it, almost sounding as if he cracked his opponent's head. It was one of his special moves that Kevin Von Erich said in this episode that it felt like as if you were being kicked by a horse. In one of the storylines, Chris had turned on Kevin and was now a heel. He then joined the tag team with Gino Hernandez, and they were known as the Dynamic Duo. Outside the ring, Chris was not a gentleman when it came to interacting with others. Kevin said that when Chris gets mad, his eyes would turn red, as you can see one of the actors portraying Chris's story with his eyes shining red. In one incident, Kevin recalled Chris almost killing a cab driver as he and Chris were late for a wrestling show. Chris took out his anger on the driver, but he and Kevin walked off as Chris had beat up the driver pretty bad. With Gino, they had people follow them as the two men went out to the party or club scene and had a fun time. They partied a lot, but this led to Gino's downfall as he died on February 2nd, 1986. His death was ruled as an overdose, but if you want to know more information about Gino Hernandez and his untimely death, check out my Gino Hernandez episode review video, as it's in the Dark Side of the Ring playlist for more information. After Gino was gone, Chris started drinking more alcohol. While Chris was in Israel, David Manning, who was a referee and booker in WCCW, received a call that Chris kicked a guy and the guy's eyes popped out of his sockets. Days later, Chris has another girlfriend named Tony, and they soon married in Hawaii. In another incident, Chris drank a lot of alcohol while he was in an airplane, so the flight attendant had to stop Chris from drinking any more alcohol. Chris was not happy about this and called one of the flight attendants the B word. The flight attendant was not having it, so she slapped him and Chris slapped her back. Soon the pilot came over and was trying to find out what was happening. Kevin said while he and Chris were in the plane, Chris's eyes turned red and he headbutted the pilot. He got arrested and served some time in jail. Kevin said that Chris brought shame to WCCW because of Chris's bad behavior. Eventually, Chris left WCCW and started a wrestling school with Tom Lance, who was a wrestling promoter. One of their students was Steve Williams, who you guys might know as Stone Cold Steve Austin, and he was Chris's protege. Chris and Steve worked with Chris's ex-girlfriend Jeannie, but soon after, Steve and Jeannie started to date each other. Chris, Jeannie, Steve, and Tony did a storyline together since Chris was the one writing it. Jeannie and Tony did not need to wrestle, but they did do hair pulling and scratched one another. As the storyline was going, there was drama between Chris and Steve as Steve and Jeannie went to WCW. It did not make Chris happy as he started drinking again. His relationship with Tony was like a roller coaster as Chris was abusive towards her. In one incident, Chris, Tony, and Chris Jr., who was a minor at the time, were in a car as Chris and Tony were arguing. A semi-truck was about to hit their car as Tony had the car stopped since she was driving it. Lucky for them, the truck went around them as they could have died from there. Chris was really upset that he beat up Tony, and after getting hit, she needed to get reconstruction surgery. Tony finally leaves Chris because she felt empty inside. He then joined the GWF, Global Wrestling Federation, and fought a wrestler named Rod Price for the GWF main title. Back then, Rod wore a weave on his head because his hair was thinning. Chris knew about it, but in a match with Rod, he ripped off his weave and bled out badly. Rod left the ring and had 200 stitches. In 1997, Chris went to WCW but wasn't as big of a star as he was in WCCW. Chris had become a jobber there and had to put talent over. He felt awful as Chris felt like he was working hard in WCW but never got over in the company. Eventually, Chris got fired because his drinking was getting out of hand as he had DWIs, driving while intoxicated. Besides alcohol, Chris was getting into GHB, which was known as the love drug that helped bodybuilders. The financial problems were bad for Chris, but he moved in with Tom Lance's friend, Brent Boo Ray Parnell, who was a wrestling fan. People who knew Chris compared him to Jekyll and Hyde, but Brent says that Chris was nice to him. However, Brent still paid rent and later felt like he was being used as Chris didn't pay for anything. Chris fell in love once again with a woman named Linda. One day, Chris and Linda took small glasses of GHB, but Brent had told Chris that he did not want that substance in his house. At 4 in the morning, Linda was on the floor as her lungs were wheezing. Chris was asleep, so Brent called Tom instead of 911. But Tom then told Brent to call the paramedics. Linda had unfortunately died, and Brent blamed Chris for her overdose. Chris was charged with manslaughter and wanted to take his own life because of Linda's death. After he got out, Chris started drinking more, and everyone who knew him were distancing themselves from him. Chris Jr. wished that someone would have stepped in and saved his dad, Chris. At Brent's mom's house, Chris was also there with them, and he and Brent had drinks. Brent told Chris to not be so loud because his mom was sleeping, but it only made Chris angrier. Chris hit Brent with a thick stick and cracked Brent's index finger. He even gouged Brent's eyes and bit his face and neck. As he was outraged, Chris's eyes turned red as Brent was explaining it in this episode. Brent got a gun and shot Chris in the heart, but he called the police after he shot Chris. Chris Jr. was told by his mom that his dad died, and he said in this episode that he didn't feel anything back then, but he did seem a little emotional while talking about it. Jade was 19 when Chris died. Chris's funeral was packed as some people from the United Kingdom also showed up. As for Brent, he went to court, but the charges were dropped due to self-defense. Neil thinks that it was not self-defense. James, Kevin, and David had a lot of good things to say about Chris during this episode. Jade wants people to remember Chris as a great athlete, and Chris Jr. said that Chris was a charming and kind father, even after everything. His daughter, Jade, kept a lot of Chris's stuff, such as his ring gear, postcards, and other things as shown in this episode. Jade said that Chris would write to her as much as he could. Interviewers for this episode are Kevin Von Erich, Jade Adams, Chris Adams' daughter, David Manning, Iceman King Parsons, Neil Adams, Chris's younger brother, Jeannie Clark, Chris's ex-girlfriend, James Beard, former referee, Chris Adams Jr., son of Chris, Tom Lance, wrestling promoter, and Brent Boo Ray Parnell, Chris's friend. Some other facts about Chris that they did not mention in this episode was that he married a woman named Karen. He fathered another daughter named Julia from his ex-girlfriend Brandy Freeman. Brandy wrestled as Miss Brandy in Chris's wrestling promotion. Unfortunately, Brandy died of a drug overdose in 2003. Chris was due in trial but had died before setting his foot in court. I gave this episode an 8 out of 10 since it did feel longer and a little dragged. It would have been nice to know more of Chris's childhood as he behaved so badly to the people around him. Throughout the episode, it made me think of why Chris was so angry all the time. For instance, his ego might have gotten the best of him when he got popular for being a gentleman in wrestling. Chris seemed like a charismatic character and was a great wrestler from the clips that I see in this episode, but in real life he was a huge jerk who respected no one. I think something happened to him that made him so angry. That or he was cocky. I do feel bad for his family for having to deal with his alcoholism. Even being absent, Chris's kids still love him, which is understandable. I myself have a father who's made some bad choices, but after everything, I still love my dad. And I know that he did his best to support me. It still doesn't excuse Chris's bad behavior for hitting his wife Tony in front of his son. Hitting your wife or husband is never, never okay. He may have been a jerk, but Chris was a good wrestler who brought the super kick that wrestlers of today still use. I'm sorry if you guys don't like my opinions on Chris Adams, but I hope you enjoyed this episode review, as I did the best that I could to make it fair. But thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Comment, like, subscribe for more videos, and until next time, take care of your mental health and everyone around you, and I'll see you next time. Bye guys.